September 30th, 1965. Jakarta, Indonesia. 2:47 a.m. Major General Suharto sat in his modest home in Menteng, awakened by urgent phone calls reporting chaos across the capital. 6 senior Indonesian generals had been dragged from their beds by troops claiming to represent a September 30th movement, a supposed effort to stop a CIA-backed coup. 3 were already dead, executed in a well outside Jakarta. The caller's voice trembled. General Yani, the army commander, was among the murdered. Suharto listened carefully, his mind already calculating. In Washington, it was still afternoon on September 29th. At CIA headquarters in Langley, officers monitoring Indonesia had no idea their worst nightmare, or perhaps their greatest opportunity, was unfolding. The agency had spent years and millions of dollars cultivating anti-communist assets in the Indonesian military. Now, those assets would get their chance. Within hours, Suharto would seize control, blame the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, for the botched kidnapping plot, and unleash a purge that would kill between 500,000 and 1 million people. The CIA's embassy team in Jakarta would provide lists, thousands of names of PKI members and suspected sympathizers. The United States would supply communications equipment and covert aid. American diplomats would privately celebrate as the world's third-largest communist party was drowned in blood. The Cold War would claim one of its highest body counts in a slaughter the West would barely acknowledge for decades. In 1965, Indonesia represented everything American Cold Warriors feared about the developing world. With 105 million people, it was the world's 5th most populous nation. The PKI, with 3 million members and millions more in affiliated organizations, was the largest communist party outside China and the Soviet Union. President Sukarno, charismatic, anti-Western, increasingly autocratic, had pulled Indonesia away from American influence and toward what he called a Beijing-Jakarta axis. Indonesia is the greatest prize in Southeast Asia, Assistant Secretary of State Roger Hilsman told Congress in 1963. If it falls to communism, the balance of power in Asia shifts dramatically. The domino theory wasn't just about Vietnam. Indonesia's 13,000 islands stretched across strategic sea lanes between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Its vast natural resources, oil, rubber, tin, made it economically vital. Its political alignment could shift the entire region. CIA Director John McCone saw Indonesia as a crucial front in the global struggle. We cannot afford to lose Indonesia the way we lost China, he warned President Johnson in a 1964 briefing. The agency had watched with alarm as Sukarno grew closer to PKI leader D.N. Idit, granting communists positions in government and attacking Western neo-colonialism with increasing vehemence. The strategic calculus was straightforward. Indonesia was drifting into the communist orbit, and conventional diplomatic pressure had failed. Sukarno had withdrawn from the United Nations, seized British and American companies, and aligned with China on foreign policy. Intelligence estimates suggested that without intervention, Indonesia would become a communist state within 2 to 3 years. Peacefully, through elections or Sukarno's decree. The PKI is winning without firing a shot, one CIA analysis concluded in early 1965. Sukarno protects them, the army fears confronting them, and their organization penetrates every level of Indonesian society. For American policymakers, this was the nightmare scenario. A strategic nation turning communist through democratic or quasi-democratic means, making military intervention impossible and economic pressure ineffective. The situation demanded subtler tools, the specialty of CIA's Far East Division. In Jakarta, CIA Station Chief Hugh Tovar and his officers understood their mission with crystalline clarity: strengthen anti-communist elements in the Indonesian military, isolate Sukarno, and be ready to exploit any opportunity that might weaken the PKI. They couldn't trigger a coup directly. The political risks were too high. But they could ensure that when the moment came, the right people had the resources, intelligence, and confidence to act. "We're not looking to start a war," one embassy cable noted. "We're positioning ourselves to help the right side win one if it starts." America's covert engagement with Indonesia stretched back to the 1950s, marked by a spectacular early failure that shaped everything that followed. In 1958, the CIA backed a regional rebellion against Sukarno, providing arms, funding, and even American pilots flying combat missions. When Indonesian forces shot down Alan Pope, a CIA contract pilot, and put him on trial, the operation's exposure humiliated Washington and strengthened Sukarno's anti-American stance. The failure taught CIA operatives a crucial lesson: direct action was too risky. The new approach, implemented throughout the early 1960s, focused on building relationships with Indonesian military officers who shared America's anti-communist goals. The Indonesian military, the TNI, was deeply fractured. Some officers admired Sukarno's nationalism and accepted cooperation with the PKI. Others, particularly in the Army's Strategic Reserve commanded by Suharto, viewed communism as an existential threat to their power and Indonesia's future. These officers became the CIA's primary focus. By 1963, the agency was running what one officer called the most extensive covert action program in the Far East outside Vietnam. The operation had multiple components, all carefully compartmentalized to maintain deniability: military training and liaison. Under cover of legitimate military assistance programs, CIA officers developed close relationships with anti-communist Indonesian officers. They invited promising commanders to training courses in the United States, where anti-communist indoctrination accompanied military instruction. Major General Suharto attended the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in 1956, an experience that shaped his worldview and connected him to American military intelligence. Communications and intelligence support. The CIA provided secure communications equipment to trusted Indonesian military units, ostensibly for counterinsurgency operations. These systems would prove crucial for coordinating anti-PKI operations. The agency also shared intelligence on PKI organization and membership, helping the military identify communist networks. Covert funding. Through front organizations and sympathetic Indonesian businessmen, the CIA channeled money to anti-communist political parties, media outlets, and youth organizations. The Muslim political parties Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah received particular attention. Their religious conservatism made them natural PKI opponents. Psychological operations. CIA-supported media organizations published anti-communist propaganda, emphasizing alleged PKI plans for violent revolution and religious persecution. Stories about communist atrocities in China and Vietnam filled Indonesian newspapers secretly funded by American money. The architect of this strategy was William Colby, CIA's Far East Division Chief from 1962 to 1967. Colby understood that overthrowing Sukarno directly was impossible. The Indonesian president remained personally popular, and the military was reluctant to move against him. Instead, the strategy aimed to isolate Sukarno by destroying his communist allies. If the PKI can be eliminated as a political force, Colby argued in a 1964 memorandum, Sukarno's nationalist rhetoric becomes less threatening. The army would be the dominant power, and the army is something we can work with. By mid-1965, the pieces were in position. CIA officers in Jakarta had cultivated dozens of contacts in the Indonesian military. The embassy maintained detailed files on PKI organization, membership lists, front organizations, key leaders in every province. These lists, compiled with the help of Indonesian informants, would become death lists within months. The agency also monitored growing tensions between the PKI and the army. Adit, the PKI chairman, was pressing Sukarno to create a fifth force of armed workers and peasants, essentially a communist militia. Army officers viewed this proposal as an existential threat. Intelligence reports noted increasing friction between communist-affiliated organizations and military-backed groups, particularly in rural Java. The situation is unstable and deteriorating, CIA's Indonesia desk warned in August 1965. A confrontation between the PKI and the army appears inevitable. The question is not if, but when and under what circumstances. The circumstances would prove far more violent than anyone anticipated. The September 30th movement remains one of the Cold War's most contested events. Was it a genuine PKI coup attempt, a rogue military operation, or a provocation orchestrated by Suharto himself to justify destroying the communists? Declassified documents suggest the truth was messier. A botched kidnapping by leftist officers, exploited brilliantly by Suharto with quiet American encouragement. September 30th, October 1st, 1955. The initial crisis. The pre-dawn kidnapping of 6 generals by Lieutenant Colonel Untung and troops from the Presidential Palace Guard caught everyone off guard, including the CIA. The September 30th movement claimed it was preventing a CIA-backed Council of Generals from overthrowing Sukarno. Whether this council actually existed remains unclear. What's certain is that the operation was catastrophically bungled. 3 generals died resisting kidnapping. 3 more were shot at a nearby well. Their bodies were dumped into the well, an atrocity that would fuel anti-communist propaganda for months. But the plotters failed to capture or kill Suharto, the Strategic Reserve commander. That single failure doomed their movement. By dawn, Suharto had taken control of loyalist troops and secured Jakarta. The September 30th movement's radio broadcasts created confusion, but no popular uprising. By October 1st, Suharto's forces had retaken the presidential palace and arrested Untung. The PKI's involvement remains debated. Adit fled Jakarta on October 1st, suggesting foreknowledge. But the party's Central Committee issued no mobilization orders, and the vast majority of PKI members were clearly unprepared for revolutionary action. Whether the September 30th movement was a rogue military operation, a botched communist coup, or something more complex, Suharto and the army treated it as definitive proof of PKI treachery, and the CIA was ready to help them capitalize. October 2nd, 1965. Washington's green light. In Washington, the initial reaction was uncertainty mixed with opportunity. At 8:15 a.m. on October 1st, Jakarta time, Ambassador Marshall Green cabled Washington, "Army has taken control. Situation fluid, but Suharto appears dominant. PKI implicated in general officers' murders." The cable reached the White House Situation Room at 9:27 p.m. Washington time on September 30th. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy immediately recognized the implications. This was the opportunity the administration had been waiting for. A pretext for the Indonesian military to move against the PKI with apparent legitimacy. President Johnson's instructions, conveyed through CIA Director William Reborn, were carefully calibrated. The United States should avoid any overt involvement. However, we should do everything possible to ensure the Indonesian army emerges victorious. CIA cables in the first week of October laid out the operational framework. Station should provide all appropriate assistance to Indonesian army elements acting against PKI. Emphasis should be on covert support that maintains plausible deniability. List materials and capabilities that might be provided without revealing U.S. hand. The materials and capabilities came quickly. On October 5th, the embassy transferred its first batch of names, more than 5,000 PKI officials and members, to the Indonesian army. They probably have a lot of blood on their hands, Deputy CIA Station Chief Joe Lazarski later acknowledged. I probably have a lot of blood on my hands too. But that's not all bad. October 10/31, 1965. The purge begins. The killing started slowly, then accelerated with terrifying speed. In Jakarta and other cities, army units arrested known PKI members. Many were executed immediately. In rural areas, the military recruited and armed Muslim youth groups, village militias, and criminal gangs to hunt communists and suspected sympathizers. The violence followed clear patterns. In Java, Muslim organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama mobilized members to identify and kill PKI supporters. In Bali, Hindu nationalist groups led the purge. In North Sumatra, ethnic tensions between indigenous Bataks and Javanese settlers, many of whom supported the PKI, turned massacres into ethnic cleansing. The army provided transportation, weapons, and lists of targets. Military units would surround villages, order PKI members and sympathizers to report, then execute them or turn them over to militias. Bodies filled rivers so densely that villagers downstream avoided using the water for weeks. In East Java, witnesses described rivers turning red. The United States provided crucial support. Communications equipment. The CIA transferred field radios and encryption devices to Indonesian military units, enabling them to coordinate operations across the archipelago. These communications tools, ostensibly for counterinsurgency, proved essential for organizing the purge. Intelligence and names. Embassy officers continued providing updated lists of PKI members. A State Department cable later acknowledged, "We generally knew what was going on, and we generally approved. We assisted them with lists of communist operatives." Economic and military aid. The Johnson administration expedited rice shipments and military supplies to Indonesia, ensuring the army had resources to maintain operations. This aid was carefully structured to appear routine, but the timing sent a clear message of support. Political cover. American diplomats privately reassured Indonesian officers that Washington understood the necessity of their actions and would not condemn them publicly. Ambassador Green told General Nasution on October 15th, "The United States government sympathizes with and supports the Army's efforts to maintain order and eliminate the communist threat." Robert Martins, a political officer in the Jakarta embassy, operated what became known as Martins' List, a card file of approximately 5,000 PKI officials compiled over several years. As the purge accelerated, Martins' List was checked and cross-referenced with Indonesian military intelligence. "It really was a big help to the army," Martins said years later. "They probably killed a lot of people, and I probably have a lot of blood on my hands. But that's not all bad. There's a time when you have to strike hard at a decisive moment." November 1965 to March 1966. Escalating violence. The purge intensified through the end of 1965. Conservative estimates suggest 200,000 dead by January 1966. More likely figures approach 500,000 to 1 million. Entire villages were slaughtered. Anyone associated with the PKI, members, sympathizers, families, became targets. The violence expanded to include ethnic Chinese, who were stereotyped as communist sympathizers, and Abangan Muslims, whose syncretic practices made them suspect to more orthodox groups. The CIA tracked the violence through field reports and intercepts. A December 1965 intelligence memorandum noted, "The massacres continue on Java and Bali. The scale is probably greater than anything since the Nazi purges of the 1930s. The Indonesian army has been remarkably efficient in destroying the PKI as an organized force." American officials understood they were witnessing mass murder. Embassy cables described wholesale killings and virtual elimination of the PKI. But Cold War calculations overrode humanitarian concerns. A State Department telegram in January 1966 acknowledged, "No one cares about Indonesia's dead communists. They're not like the Jews. Nobody is going to question it." The Johnson administration's public response was carefully neutral. When questioned about violence in Indonesia, State Department spokesman Robert McCloskey said only, "We are following events closely and hope that stability can be restored." Privately, officials celebrated. The reversal of fortunes in Indonesia is one of the most significant developments of the year in Southeast Asia. A National Security Council briefing paper concluded. American adaptation, expanding support. As the purge continued, American support evolved from passive encouragement to active assistance. Training and coordination, U.S. military advisors worked with Indonesian officers to improve security operations. While officially focused on separatist insurgencies, these programs clearly encompassed anti-communist campaigns. Economic leverage. The United States coordinated with the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to prepare economic assistance packages for post-Sukarno Indonesia. These negotiations sent a clear signal. Indonesia's economic future depended on eliminating communist influence. Media operations. CIA-funded media outlets amplified stories of PKI atrocities, particularly allegations, some fabricated, that communists had tortured the murdered generals before killing them. These stories, heavily promoted in Indonesian media, intensified public rage and justified further violence. Regional coordination. The CIA coordinated with allied intelligence services in Australia, Britain, and Japan to ensure a unified Western response supporting the Indonesian military. Soviet and Chinese responses. The communist powers responded with surprising restraint, constrained by their own strategic calculations and internal divisions. The Soviet Union maintained diplomatic relations with Indonesia and avoided strong condemnation of the massacres. Moscow's priority was preserving its relationship with Sukarno, not defending the PKI. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin reportedly told Asian communist leaders, "The Indonesian comrades made serious strategic errors. We cannot rescue them from the consequences." China's response was more vocal but equally ineffective. Beijing condemned the fascist military coup and provided asylum to PKI leaders who escaped Indonesia. But China was entering its cultural revolution and lacked capacity for meaningful intervention. The Sino-Soviet split also prevented coordinated communist response. Moscow and Beijing competed for influence rather than cooperating to protect Indonesia's communists. The PKI's destruction demonstrated a crucial Cold War reality. International communist solidarity was largely rhetorical. When national interests conflicted with ideological unity, realpolitik prevailed. Indonesian military consolidation Suharto methodically consolidated power through early 1966. He forced Sukarno to delegate authority through a March 11th decree known as Super Samar, giving Suharto emergency powers. The purge continued, now targeting Sukarno loyalists alongside remaining communists. By mid-1966, Suharto controlled the military, the government, and Indonesia's political future. The violence had achieved its objectives. The PKI was destroyed as a political force, communist ideology was criminalized, and the Indonesian left was decapitated. Suharto's New Order regime would rule for 32 years, maintaining close ties with the United States and opening Indonesia's economy to Western investment. By spring 1966, the final phase. By March 1966, the organized killing had largely ended, replaced by imprisonment and political persecution. Between 600,000 and 1 million people were detained in camps and prisons without trial. Many remained imprisoned for more than a decade. The violence had been staggering in its scope. Entire social networks destroyed, communities traumatized, and Indonesian politics fundamentally reordered. The CIA station in Jakarta sent a triumphant cable to Langley in April 1966. The events in Indonesia over the past 6 months represent one of the most significant anti-communist victories of the Cold War. The PKI, once the strongest communist party in the non-communist world, has been effectively eliminated as a political force. The Indonesian army, with which we have cultivated relationships for years, is now the dominant power. American interests in the region have been substantially secured. The operational success was undeniable. Indonesia had shifted from a nation drifting toward communism to a firmly anti-communist military dictatorship aligned with Western interests. The domino that threatened to fall had been caught through methods that would remain classified for decades. Strategic vindication. For American Cold Warriors, Indonesia validated the strategy of covert action. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices, McGeorge Bundy reflected years later. Indonesia was such a choice. Could we have achieved the same result without bloodshed? Probably not. Was the alternative, a communist Indonesia, worse? Absolutely. The practical benefits for American interests were substantial. Strategic realignment. Indonesia became a cornerstone of anti-communist stability in Southeast Asia. Suharto's regime cooperated with American initiatives, provided military bases, and opposed communist movements throughout the region. Economic access. American companies gained access to Indonesia's oil fields, mining operations, and markets. Freeport-McMoran's Papua copper mine became one of the world's largest mining operations. Regional influence. Indonesia's shift strengthened ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as an anti-communist bloc. The ASEAN way of political stability, prioritizing economic development over democracy, became a model for the region. Demonstration effect. The Indonesian Purge showed communist parties worldwide that the United States would support whatever measures necessary to prevent communist victories. The message was clear. Cold War stakes justified extreme responses. The human cost. The bodies told a different story. In villages across Java and Bali, mass graves held victims whose only crime was membership in agricultural cooperatives or women's organizations affiliated with the PKI. Teachers, midwives, farmers, and union organizers died alongside communist officials. Entire families were wiped out. Children became orphans. Communities were fractured by violence that pitted neighbors against neighbors. Survivors carried trauma for generations. Many were stigmatized as communist families and faced discrimination in employment, education, and politics. Indonesia's official history, controlled by Suharto's regime, blamed the PKI for the September 30th violence, while minimizing or justifying the subsequent massacres. Only after Suharto's fall in 1998 did some discussion of the violence become possible. And even then, many perpetrators faced no accountability. The silence extended internationally. Unlike the Holocaust, Cambodia's killing fields, or other mass atrocities, Indonesia's 1965-66 massacres remained largely unknown outside academic circles. The United States had no interest in publicizing its role. Indonesia's government suppressed discussion. Survivor testimony was ignored or dismissed. The world forgot us, one survivor told researchers decades later. They forgot because remembering would be inconvenient. The Indonesian tragedy reveals Cold War logic at its most brutal and pragmatic. American officials made a calculated decision. Destroying the PKI justified supporting mass murder. The strategic gain, preventing Indonesia from aligning with communist powers outweighed humanitarian costs. Declassified documents from the 1990s and 2000s confirmed long-suspected American involvement. The CIA's provision of names, communications equipment, and political support was documented in cables, memoranda, and oral histories. The scale of American foreknowledge became clear. Officials understood the violence was massive and indiscriminate, yet maintained support. The operation became a template for Cold War covert action in the developing world. When similar anti-communist purges occurred in Chile, 1973, Argentina, 1976, and Central America during the 1980s, the Indonesian model influenced American responses. Work through local military forces, provide intelligence and equipment, maintain deniability, and prioritize strategic outcomes over humanitarian concerns. For Indonesia, the consequences shaped the nation's trajectory for decades. Suharto's new order brought economic growth and stability, but at the cost of democracy, human rights, and political freedom. The 1965-66 violence established military dominance over civilian politics. The criminalization of communism and broadly defined communist ideas stifled left-wing politics and labor organizing. Indonesia's political spectrum shifted permanently rightward. The Indonesian case also illuminates uncomfortable truths about American Cold War policy. The domino theory wasn't just defensive. It justified offensive operations to prevent even democratic or popular communist victories. The commitment to containing communism overrode other values, including human rights and self-determination. Covert action allowed policymakers to pursue goals they couldn't openly acknowledge. September 30, 1965, Jakarta, 2:47 a.m. Suharto answered that urgent phone call, not knowing he would become dictator of Indonesia for 3 decades. Sea officers in Langley monitoring overnight cables couldn't have predicted the massacre that was beginning. But the infrastructure was in place. The relationships, the intelligence, the understanding that when opportunity came, the United States would help anti-communist forces seize it. Between 500,000 and 1 million people died in what became one of the 20th century's largest massacres. The PKI was destroyed. Indonesia remained in the Western orbit. American strategic interests were served. The bodies in unmarked graves across Java, Bali, and Sumatra are Cold War casualties as surely as any soldier who died in Korea or Vietnam. But their deaths happened in silence, with Western complicity, and for decades with barely an acknowledgement that something terrible had occurred. That silence, perhaps, is the most revealing legacy of all.